Thanks, Amanda, and thanks, Ann, for having me. So quick raise of hands. Who's heard of the Center for Energy Studies at LSU? All right, good number. So we're kind of a unique group in that, you got these academic centers and institutes, and they typically come from the university that has this idea, and then they go pitch that to the legislature, whoever, the Board of Regents, to create that. The center was kind of the opposite. We were created by the legislature directly in the early 1980s. And if you go back to the 1980s, late 1970s, and this will come full circle with what I'm about to talk about here, between 40 and 50% of the state's revenues directly came from oil and gas. Just think about that. That was just severance taxes and royalties for production on state lands and water bottoms. Today, that's about 5%, to give you perspective. And so at the time, you had all these different groups coming to the legislature. You had, of course, the oil and gas industry, the petrochemicals, the utilities, the plaintiff attorneys that like suing all these people, right? No media in the room. All right, we're good. And then the environmental lobby. And at some point, some of the legislators who were there at the time told me, like, Greg, we just didn't know what to believe. So we created the Center for Energy Studies, and really our job is to be there not to promote any individual energy source, but just to be there to provide evidence-based information. And so that's what we do. We've been working very closely with Amanda and her office, as well as the legislature in terms of reorganizing LSU's energy functions into a new energy institute, which will include Center for Energy Studies right now in order to kind of parallel the great work going on at the state. So today what I'm going to talk about, and fairly quickly, is going to be, I think, one of the things that has been, I'm going to be candid, one of the most stressful things when I go speak to communities. What is this word decarbonization? It's kind of a naughty word some days. What does that mean? What are the implications for us in Louisiana? And why should we care about it? And why is this something that's stressful for these communities? So I'm going to start with a brief economic overview, talk about some of the decarbonization policies, and then we'll probably skip towards the channels towards decarbonization. Of course, one of them that you're going to talk about these next 2 days, which is, of course, the transportation sector. So this is U.S. employment. And this is what's called non-farm employment. Economists refer to it as the establishment survey. And so as you can see, in the 1990s, we had that decade of growth. Then we had the 2001 recession with the oil price shock, the wars in the Middle East. We then grew out of that to the Great Recession, which was the largest recession since the Great Depression in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And then we entered the longest period of economic growth in the United States since we've been tracking this data. And then, of course, you have the pandemic, the V there. And today we're somewhere around the ballpark of, let's say, 4% above that pre-pandemic employment. So this is what's going on in the United States. So you might ask, well, why are you showing me this? What does that have to do with decarbonization? Well, I'm going to show the same graph here for Louisiana. So you can see that the 1990s, you had, of course, that economic growth, and it kind of moved in lockstep with the U.S. You had the 2001 recession, hit a little bit muted to Louisiana. And then what is that first V there? Does anyone know? We just celebrated the 20th anniversary. That was Hurricane Katrina, right? And not to downplay other hurricanes, but that was an enormous storm event, impacted our state dramatically. We grew, kind of back almost to the pre-Katrina peak, and then the 2009 recession happened. Then again, we started growing with the U.S. economy. And then what happened right there in 2014, 2015? Does anyone know? Oil price crash. Oil price went from, over $100 a barrel to $30 a barrel in about a 6-month period. This put Louisiana into a recession, while at the same time the U.S. was in expansion mode. And as you can see, we are just now reaching that pre-2014 oil price peak. Just think about that for a minute. So we had the flat line, we had the pandemic, and there we are coming back right at that peak today. And so the thing I want to just really highlight here is that when we talk about decarbonization, we've got to understand, and we're understanding, well, why is this a stressful thing for some of these communities? Because a lot of these communities experience this history of the energy sector and how that's impacting them. And so when we're talking about policies that are impacting that sector, I think this gives a lot of perspective for that. I'm going to show you here, this is upstream oil and gas employment. So this is, think of the people drilling wells and producing hydrocarbons. We had about 50,000 workers in that sector pre-2014 price crash. We lost between somewhere in the ballpark of 17,000 to 18,000 workers in that one sector. Then that's what put the state into the recession that I just showed you. Then we flatlined out. Then we lost another about 8,000 during the pandemic. And there you can see the kind of flat line after that. The yellow dotted line was our forecast last year. And by the way, we're about to release our forecast this year for our energy outlook. We'll be doing it in November. It's a free webinar. You should join us if you're not a part of it. Email Ann and she'll put you in contact with us. And you can see that was our forecast, and the data has actually been revised downward. You see the break worse than that. And so it's been flat, okay? Oil and gas employment continues to be flat, and it's about half of what it was before that 2014 price crash. But what has happened to production over that same time period? Production has continued to increase. Of course, we could look at like just oil production on state lands and waters, and you can get some nuance. But when you look at oil and gas production in the United States, you look at it in the Gulf Coast region, that has continued to increase. And so I'm not going to show data today, but if you look at the US, if you look at Texas, you see a very similar pattern here, is that we need less workers to produce more output. And I'm going to pick on some of my economic development friends here that say, you know, jobs, 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 hurrah, let's go get more jobs. You know, to an economist, a job is actually an input. It's a cost, not a benefit. So how do we become better off over time? We'll become better off by having less inputs to create more outputs. And ultimately, that's what drives economic growth. Ultimately, that's what drives wage growth happening faster than inflation. We're more efficient. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the energy sector here. So some people say, are we going back to the pre-2014 price crash days? Is this some policy regime that's created this? Is this some price shock? And my view is that it's a more fundamental thing in terms of that efficiency, which is what you want to see in a sector, but which of course impacts those communities that have a heavy exposure to that. At the same time, we have seen historic investments in the manufacturing of these hydrocarbons that we're producing. So that's going to be the refining, chemical manufacturing, you know, ammonia production, all of the export of natural gas in the form of liquefied natural gas. And right now, about a third of the announced projects that are out there all have this decarbonization component of it. And so as you can see here, this shows you employment in the refining chemical manufacturing sector that has continued to grow through the last decade. Of course, you had the reduction with the pandemic, and then we're now past that pre-pandemic peak, and we're forecasting that that's going to continue to increase here. Okay. So what does that mean for Louisiana? Well, you know, we talk about okay, so let's talk about energy demand. What do you think has happened to the demand for energy in the United States over the same time period that I showed you oil and gas production increasing? You think it's gone up? Okay. Anyone think it's gone down? No? Anyone think flat? Yeah, we got one flat person. Okay, all right. See, you know, Abby's back there cheating because she's seen me say this before. So, you know, so indeed, energy demand has been extremely flat. Okay, over this last same time period, and the reason for that is you've got two things when we model energy demand. On one hand, you have economic growth that's going to lead to the increase in the demand for energy. But on the other hand, you have efficiency gains, okay? So I'll give you a personal story that happened to me. Me and my wife had our third child, and, you know, we walk out to her 2010, I'm going to date myself here, Toyota RAV4, the year that we were married, got her a car. And we're like, oh my gosh, 3 car seats can't fit in this thing, right? Okay. So we go and we upgrade her to to a Highlander, a new Highlander. What do you think the 2022 Highlander's fuel economy was relative to the 2010 RAV4? The 3-row versus the 2-row. It was actually about the same, 1 mile per gallon better. Had we gotten the new RAV, I think it would have been 40 miles of the gallon or something. Okay. In the same 6-month period, our washer, our dryer, and our dishwasher, you know, all the appliances all go out at the same time. Oh, great. This is great luck. Okay, what do you think happened to our energy consumption and water consumption at our house? Well, no, it went up. We had a third kid. Come on, you know, what are you talking about here, okay? Yeah, so no, but it's going to be more efficient. So would I have gone and bought a new car and bought new appliances for my energy savings and my water savings? My checking account will absolutely tell you that would not have been the case. But when we replace these things, okay, what's going to happen is they're going to be more efficient. And in the United States and in Western Europe, these two things are about in balance. So we've had an increase in the supply of energy. And by the way, I could show you renewable energy production, same thing, huge increases in supply. Demand has been flat. So what has happened, this is what's facilitated all of this investment. It's been the export of these products all over the world. And so Louisiana, unlike the rest of the world, is a net exporter to the world. We're not a net importer like the rest of the United States. And that is facilitated by, we can show crude oil, refined products, total net exports of oil and gas, refined products, chemicals, has increased over this time period because of those trends that we're talking about. All right. So, and there's natural gas. So I'm going to, show you this. This is upstream versus refining chemical employment. And we employ more people in what we call energy manufacturing today than we do in the upstream space. And by the way, Texas is still very different. They still, despite the trend of reducing employment, they still employ a lot more in that upstream space. Okay. So what is the deal with decarbonization? So when we look at the emissions of Louisiana relative to the U.S., you got transportation, electricity are the big two, and then industrial's a third, kind of distant third place in terms of total emissions. Louisiana, and the most recent data, which is a little bit lagged, but it's almost 60% of our emissions are these industrial emissions. So when we're talking about decarbonization in Louisiana, that's really what we're talking about is these industrial emissions. And what we're seeing is that, that these companies all over the world, so the companies that invest here in Louisiana, they're international companies. They're deploying capital all over the world. And they're looking out to the world and they're seeing policies such as Europe's carbon border adjustment mechanism. They're seeing all these decarbonization commitments and they're telling themselves, they're like, okay, look, there's kind of two paths I can go here, if you will. One is, you've got all these people all over the world. They're saying they want these low carbon intensive products. We're exporting these products all over the world. Why don't we go net zero? Let's say, you know what? People want low carbon products. We're going to do it. And if we go that route, what do you think is going to happen to the cost of our products? If we demand net zero by some date, is this going to be free? Absolutely not. There's costs associated with this. And so if we go that route, what we might find is that our products are too expensive for that global marketplace, in which case not only are we going to not have the investment here, but also you're not going to ultimately achieve that global decarbonization because people will just purchase from somewhere else. The other extreme, I call it the ostrich approach, where I say, you know what? I don't want to think about this. We've got a century of oil and gas and petrochemicals here in Louisiana. We're going to do business like usual, and I'm going to stick my head in the sand and not think about it. If we go that route, what we might find is other parts of the world are going to achieve that balance more, in a more stable way. I was in Riyadh a few years ago, and it was a meeting at CAPSARC, King Abdullah's Petroleum Research Center. And it was 700 energy economists from all over the world. Very good meeting. But the thing that really stuck out to me is what the Saudis were saying is, I don't have to be net zero. I just want to export these products that's a little less carbon intensive than the other Gulf Coast of the world, the Gulf Coast of the U.S. Just think about that for a minute. And this is the balance, and this is the challenge of the imbalance of the decarbonization. It's not one extreme or the other, but it's how do we achieve emissions reductions in a way that's also cost competitiveness. It's also cost competitive. So you see emissions intensity of GDP has been declining, not only in the U.S., but all over the world, which is great news. The U.S. is kind of in the middle of the pack here in terms of our emissions intensity of GDP. And this is not a fair apples to apples comparison, by the way, because different countries have different industrial activities. But as you can see, the G7, we're kind of on the upper end of. But if you look at the OPEC countries, we're actually very competitive in terms of our emissions intensity. And this shows you CO2 emissions intensity of real GDP declining over time, which we're doing really good. We're about half of what we were, 50 years ago. Okay, so is decarbonization a risk or an opportunity? So we view it as a challenge. Decarbonization will not only challenge existing Gulf Coast energy manufacturing, but also create an opportunity for leadership in the development of production and capacity for liquid fuels, chemicals, plastics, fertilizers, all these products that have historically been derived from fossil fuels or just very energy intensive to produce. That are either lower or even perhaps one day net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Decarbonization has created considerable investment opportunity in the short run, and we see a lot of these investments going on that I'm sure you'll talk about more over the next 2 days. But in the long run, we really view it as it's this balance of the cost to achieve those emissions reductions with that global market's willingness to pay for those low carbon intensity products. Of course, subsidies and policies will get you there, to kind of spur that growth over the next decade or so. But in the long run, the question is will this global market be willing to pay a premium for these low carbon intensity products? And that is a question that for perhaps anywhere in the world is very important for us to understand and answer. So with that, Louisiana's road decarbonization, I'm going to try to skip through this, get us back on track with time. But of course, you got electrification and decarbonization of the grid. A lot going on there, very exciting. Of course, offshore wind's been sputtered. We've got carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which if you've been following this has been a really contentious issue in Louisiana. A lot of these communities are asking questions about how this impacts them. There's regulatory questions. There's revenue questions for these local communities, especially the ones that are receiving the carbon injected versus the one with the industrial activity for which the product is produced. And we've got a great white paper on that. You can look on our website that I'll skip through here. Then we got hydrogen production, of course, is something very interesting to this group. There's a clean hydrogen task force at the legislature. I think we meet next Tuesday, if I remember correctly. Have the opportunity to sit on. And we've got a white paper that Dr. Mandalika here will be talking about, I think, tomorrow. In terms of putting that in perspective. And then, of course, you got biopetrochemicals, which Louisiana, of course, has an enormous opportunity for and is ground zero. So with that, Louisiana is likely going to be impacted by decarbonization policies, regardless of the political actions taken by the state of Louisiana and by even the U.S. government. And I think that this is a really important message to tell folks. Louisiana has experienced growth in these refining, chemical manufacturing industries with significant greenhouse gas emissions, and industrial decarbonization is of interest to these companies, and there are different channels to do that, and of course one of them is low carbon fuels. All right, well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.